Yeah.
Jitu bhaiya, we are live.
Yeah. Okay. Very good morning to all. Friends, many of you are already here. We have started this initiative ECA at the rate 11. So we are on a regular basis, last 8-9 days, help you to come over this lockdown monologue. And definitely by bringing before you the very interesting topic from health to fitness, from economy, and also on the technical subject. So, friends, thank you all for joining in great numbers. We are also beaming our session live on Facebook, and all our videos since the day one we have started this ACA at level is also posted at YouTube. So today we have with us none other than Sri Haigreve Khaitan, his senior partner, Khaitan and Company, and then our next speaker is Sri Abizer Diwanji, Head Financial Services Partner E&Y. We also have with us Sri P.R. Ramesh, our past president, who is joining from Bangalore. Friends, before I hand over this proceedings to Banjaraji, who will be coordinating this session today, let me tell you about the other session we will be having in next 2 to 3 days. On 8th April, that is tomorrow, we will be having a session on gratitude in giving. Friends, during the COVID scenario, as we all know, there are a lot of underprivileged people who are waiting for your help. So let us rather intrigue ourselves. How do we give back to the society with Sri Ravindra Chamadiyaji, he is CMD, Infinity Group, and Sri Rajesh Kumar Jain, well-known book author. Then on 9th April, we will be having a session on changes in IBC code and change in focus in wake of COVID-19, wherein Ms. Kasturi Ghosh, Ms. Pooja Sinha, and Ms. Mamta Binani would be speaking on the subject. Friends, we have also started a session or 5 days workshop on Excel in Excel, MS Excel for all. This session would be spread out through 5 sessions, 1 hour each per day. And friends, let me tell you, we have not kept any registration charges for this session. Yes, but still we have received 1010 registration till date. And friends, we have put one condition for our registrant and participant that to allow you to participate in the or register in the session, you have to either declare that you have contributed to COVID course, or you will have to give the commitment for giving the contribution in the COVID funds, any of the COVID funds. We haven't taken any registration or any funds directly, but we have received 243 registrations with the commitment of 14.01 lakhs to various COVID funds. And 408 participants committed that they will contribute in future, but the amount was not mentioned. And 359 participants has registered by saying that they have already contributed to the COVID, any of the COVID fund before registering in our session. Friends, this is the synopsis of the programs we'll be having for the days to come, and definitely on daily basis at 11, we'll be having more such programs. So with this, friends, thank you all for joining. Let us immediately, I hand over the session to Banjaraji to kindly start the session and introduce our guest speaker. Over to you, Banjaraji.
Thank you, Jitendra, and thank you and welcome all of you. To begin with, we have first speaker for the day is Mr. Haigreve Khaitan. We all know he's a senior partner at Khaitan and Company, which is a 110-year-old law firm, one of the India's oldest and one of the most recognized law firms in the country. Haigreve ji heads the firm's corporate and M&A and private equity practice. He is constantly ranked as one of India's top corporate lawyers. He is also an independent director in very many prominent corporate like Mahindra, JSW, Torrent, Scott, to name a few. The next speaker of the day will be Mr. Abizer Diwanji, the partner at E&Y India. He is the head of financial services of EY, and he founded this debt and restructuring business in 2014. For more than 2 decades, he is involved in banking and non-banking financial services, insurance companies, asset reconstruction of firms, etc. He is the part of some of the industry and government advisory bodies as well. Presently, he is a member of the task force for RBI on development of secondary market for corporate loans. So thank you both the speakers for giving your valuable time, and I'm sure all the participants today will immensely benefit from the two learned speakers and their experiences and wisdom. So I hand over to Su Haigreve ji, will be the first speaker for the day. Haigreve ji, all yours.
Friends, just a minute. Uh, you can post your question in the chat box where our speaker is still speaking on the subject, and Banjara ji will take up the question once he concludes his session. Sir, please, over to you.
So thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to speak with all of you today in this August digital gathering. So with that, I'll just start with my presentation. So, I will start by saying, I chose this flower as the cover slide for my presentation because this is really from the spring cherry blossom. And amongst all of the bloom, I thought this bloom is very important to see. And we are all hoping to see this bloom again in real time rather than digitally. I divided my section really. What I'm going to talk about is some of the legal issues emerging out of COVID and out of the shutdown. And I've divided the legal issues into 4 categories. First category is in relation to contracts and whether it is purchase obligations, sale obligations, real estate. The second part is in relation to work and employment and legal issues arising on work and employment in relation to lockout. The third is really in relation to some of the changes on financing in banks. I'll keep that part short, and I know Abizer is going to cover that in more detail. And the fourth really is some of the issues promoters are facing, and as corporate advisors, what we might be required to actually brief promoters. First part really is in relation to contracts. So when we talk about the contract, we are really talking about an enforceable obligation between parties, and those who are parties to the contract have to obey the contract. It's legally binding, and any breach of the contract by any of the parties leads to damages. It can lead to indemnity claims. The party in breach can be required to specifically perform the contract, can suffer an injunction, and of course, reputational damage. So a contract is really where legally you're obliged to obey. So what is really this concept of force majeure we've all been reading about? The word or the expression force majeure really comes from the French word force majeure, which means superior force. And what the law really provides is that if there is a superior force or there are unexpected circumstances beyond the control of the parties, then while you are obliged to follow the contract and liable, in the case of force majeure, you're not liable to follow the contract and you get excused from performing the contract. And if you're excused from performing the contract, you don't suffer damages and you can't be taken to court. You can't specifically perform against yourself. So that is really the concept of force majeure. When we deal with the concept of force majeure, we must really then discuss, is force majeure readily available under any contract, anytime, every time? What really is available as force majeure? Just because COVID has happened, just because there is a lockdown, can I stop performing all contracts, or can my counterparty stop performing all its obligations? So when we discuss that, there are really 2 concepts. One is you have to really look at your own contract and what is the provision of force majeure in your contract. Does it at all have a force majeure clause? And if it has a force majeure clause, what does the force majeure clause state? And it is really contractual, dependent on what the force majeure clause says. If the force majeure clause says that, look, a party is excused from performing by reason of force majeure, then you are excused from performing. The more important part is, how is force majeure defined in the contract? Does the force majeure provision in that contract which you're looking at provide that epidemics or pandemics will be a force majeure event? So it is all dependent on what the contract says and whether this whole event is covered within the definition of force majeure in your very contract. You may have a force majeure clause which may say flood, fire, earthquake, tempest, destruction. All of that will not help you then, because that does not cover epidemics and pandemics. If on the other hand, if you have a force majeure clause which says that you can't perform the contract because of government order, then that will cover you. If it says pandemic, it will cover you. Epidemic, it will cover you. Or even if you have a simple force majeure clause which says that, look, you are unable to perform for no fault of yours for reasons beyond your control. That is very simple language in a force majeure clause, but a very wide and broad clause which covers you much more than 10 events provided there, which may not cover pandemic or epidemic. So that is what your contract provides. There is another statutory concept where you might be get relief and not be liable to perform a contract. That what we call is frustration, and what we call is impossibility of contract. So if your contract doesn't provide anything, but it becomes absolutely impossible to or illegal to perform a certain act under the contract, then you're excused from performing, but there is no suspension under law. You either perform or you terminate the contract. Unlike force majeure, you benefit of suspension during a time. The contract is still alive, but you don't perform during the period of force majeure. In the case of statutory relief, that is frustration or it being illegal, you decide that, look, it is illegal to perform this contract now, or it is impossible to perform this contract. So either I come out of the contract or I stay in the contract. I cannot then claim force majeure if I don't have a force majeure clause. So I'll give you an example of frustration. So if I had to deliver goods, let's say on a specified date to my customer, and that date happens to be during the lockdown period, I can't deliver the goods. I don't have a force majeure clause in the contract. Then I have to really decide that this is illegal now. It is impossible for me to deliver. The contract can be terminated. I can come out of the contract, not be liable to my customer, and the customer cannot enforce. On the other hand, if I had a force majeure clause, I can invoke force majeure, suspend it for the period of lockdown, and perform the contract after the lockdown is over. Force majeure clauses have to be read very carefully. There are usually notice provisions under the clause. You have to strictly follow the notice provision. Usual clauses say that if there's a force majeure event, you have to give notice immediately or within 1 day, within 3 days. You have to cite what exactly the force majeure event is, what relief you are giving. And practically, you have to also think whether you really want to invoke force majeure. You may have a long-term supplier, you may have a long-term customer, you may get relief temporarily today, but you might spoil long-term relationships. So maybe you need a thoughtful approach, and in that thoughtful approach, whether or not to invoke it or to speak and then act is something to think about. Before I finish the chapter on force majeure and contracts, I'll talk about two examples. The first is, let's take you have a contract for import of goods. And due to COVID-19, the ship which is carrying the goods is not able to dock or it's not able to unload. Can I invoke force majeure and not take delivery and not pay to the supplier, or prevent him from encashing the letter of credit? It will all depend on the contract. If the contract is CIF or FOB, then the title to the goods have already passed. The risk is already on me, and it is my duty vis-a-vis clearance. That is my responsibility. Taking delivery is my responsibility. I cannot claim force majeure vis-a-vis the supplier, even if I have a force majeure clause in the contract. On the other hand, if my contract is DDU, delivered duty unpaid, or DDP, delivered duty paid, then the title and risk has not passed. And if I have a force majeure clause, I can claim force majeure, invoke force majeure, and then the contract will be suspended. I don't need to take delivery, and I don't need to pay for this period of force majeure. Another example I'll take is of, say, a utility supply agreement. And let's say a lot of questions have been asked on power purchase agreements. There's an obligation to supply, there's an obligation to take and pay. Now, as far as utility is concerned, it's ready and willing to supply, and there is no force majeure event vis-a-vis the supply itself. There's no force majeure event. The banks are not shut. I can still pay as a buyer of electricity. So can I really claim? Sure, there is no force majeure here, because the force majeure must be in relation to my obligations. My obligation is to take. I can take electricity supply. There is no bar. My obligation is to pay. I can pay. There is no bar. Commercial difficulty in relation to payment or commercial issues cannot be force majeure. So it is unlikely that under these contracts we will be able to take force majeure relief. So with that, I really complete the section. I have a small section on real estate contracts. We'll talk about as we move on. And I'll move to the next section, and that is in relation to insurance. When we talk about insurance, again, a lot of questions are coming up and being discussed as to whether or not this event will be covered by insurance, whether I will get insurance coverage or not. The simple answer is it all depends on your insurance policy. It all depends on the coverage you've taken. Typically, business interruption risk insurance has a complete carve-out for epidemics and pandemics. It has a complete carve-out for government action. And if those carve-outs are there, then even if you've taken comprehensive business interruption policy and the coverage is not there, you will not get covered for business interruption. Most business interruption policies have 12 risks covered. Typically, risks like fire, terrorism, floods, earthquake, a natural calamity, and COVID is not a natural calamity. So you will not get coverage under the business interruption policy. Now, question is, are there policies with all-inclusive coverage? Yes, there are policies with all-inclusive coverage. And at least going forward and in the future, one can read policy terms carefully, negotiate. The premiums may be higher, but one may be able to get complete coverage. Also, coverage in relation to loss of opportunity, loss of profit. These are usually not covered, so it's very important to think as to what the coverage is under the policy. I'll give you one example. When the terrorist attacks took place in Bombay, we know that the two major hotels suffered the attack and they lodged claims. When they lodged claims, they had a business interruption policy with coverage for terrorist attacks or terrorism. When they claimed loss of profit for the entire period of the attack, the closure, the renovation, the repairs. Now, apart from the loss and damage to property, when you claim under the business interruption policy for loss of profit, they were allowed the claim only for the days of the terrorist attack. They were not allowed the claim for the period the government asked them to close the hotels. They were not allowed the claim for the period they had to close the hotel to renovate. because the policy was restricted to business interruption during the period of terrorist attack. Now, if it is only for during the period of terrorist attack, any other period, government action and repairs, renovation, not covered under business interruption. So very, very important to read and negotiate the coverage. Another important issue arising is in relation to health and Medicare policy. Most health and Mediclaim policies exclude epidemic diseases. There are again policies which do cover it, and you need to examine your personal policy, you need to examine your group policies, your client's group policies, whether or not there is coverage. Of course, IRDA is coming up with guidelines that insurance companies should honor COVID claims. At the moment, government is also bearing a lot of the COVID expenses. But IRDA is also coming up with policies that in future, epidemics should be covered in Mediclaim policies. But for the present, there may be a problem unless there is policy coverage. I'll quickly move to, again, contracts and some examples of real estate contracts, and simple questions being asked that, look, if I'm a tenant, I'm a landlord, can I claim force majeure or not? The principle remains exactly the same as for general contracts. What is the provision in your contract for force majeure? If your contract does not have a force majeure clause, you cannot claim it. If you have a lease, the Transfer of Property Act gives you relief only if the property is actually damaged or destroyed. If the property is not damaged or destroyed, it doesn't give you relief. But the terms of the lease, the terms of your leave-in license, if they have a force majeure clause well drafted, you should be able to claim relief as a tenant. And if it's well drafted on the other side, that it's restricted, then you may not be able to give relief as a landlord, and which may be in your favor. I've looked at dozens of real estate contracts over the last few days, clients coming to us, and I've seen so many drafting issues where all sorts of events are covered, but it says that if the property is damaged or destroyed, in some cases it says permanently damaged or destroyed by reason of following acts, then only you can claim force majeure. Now we know that COVID is not destroying or damaging the property. There is inability to use, but that event is not covered. So even if epidemics is covered, some clauses are so defective which says that if the property is damaged or destroyed because of fire, earthquake, epidemics, yes, epidemics covered, but it is not damaged or destroyed. So then in those cases, you can't claim force majeure and you have to pay your rents, no option. Another issue on RERA projects for those doing real estate development. Under the statutory definition of RERA, this is not a force majeure event and not covered. State governments like Maharashtra have actually now notified that this event will be a force majeure event under RERA, and they've granted a 3-month extension, both for the registrations and for completion of project without penalty. And I think other state governments will follow suit. And I believe Rajasthan is doing the same, and other states will probably notify, but most corporate provisions, the statutory provisions do not cover this as a force majeure event. I think I'm conscious of time. I have a section on employment. I don't know whether I should continue or let Abizer speak, because I think I've already eaten up the 15 minutes.
I think Haigreve 2-3 minutes or conclude.
Okay. So I'll just talk about quickly on employment and work. I think on employment or work, I have really 3 sections. The first section is around this whole work from home policy. And we are talking about work from home. What are you supposed to do? Firstly, if you're doing work from home in organizations, you have to see, do you have a work from home policy? Get your IT and HR teams to devise a policy, circulate to the members. There are lots of IT challenges. Look at your customer contracts. if you're a service provider, your customer contracts may actually restrict you from work from home. If it restricts you from work from home, you have to actually take customer consent, otherwise you're in breach. You have to deal with privacy issues, security issues, and all of these can restrict work from home. Essential functions, questions are arising that, look, if I'm an essential function, can I actually force my employees to work? Yes, you can force your employees to work if you're an essential function, but you have to provide safe passage. You have to provide a safe environment. If you can't provide safe passage to your employee from place of home to place of work, or a space environment, working environment, then you cannot force an employee to work, even if it's an essential function. We had a recent case of Best, our electricity supplier in Mumbai, again forcing and issuing notices to the employees that, look, you're not reporting to work. And the employees said that, look, I have no way to come to work. You're not providing me safe passage. You're not providing me a safe environment. And how can you, even if it's an essential function, then force me to work? Again, lots of questions arising in this temporary shutdown. Can I actually lay off people? What is the legal validity of all of these advisories under the Disaster Management Act and then of the state governments? Very few state governments have actually passed orders under labor laws. They've all given advisories. These advisories are only advisories. They do not have the sanctity of enforcement under law. And you can actually act under law to pay labor less, to pay your employees less, to lay off. But I'm not for a moment suggesting that you do that. This is a very sensitive time. You have to deal with employees very carefully. And given the situation, it is the best course is to negotiate, to have an agreement with employees, either for lower wages, for part payment, for agreeing to a stepped up wage once the environment changes, rather than act on a pure legal basis that these are only advisories. Same issues are rising in respect of new joinees. If your offers are given, date of joining is not there, can you rescind those? Yes, you can rescind those. The law is very clear that in case of employment, until date of joining, you can rescind it. After lockout opens up, can you actually rationalize? Can you reduce workforce? Can you terminate? Yes, you can do all of that. All of those options are fully available. And again, to summarize, leave benefits, the government has again come up. This is all going to be leave period, paid leave. If there's COVID employee who is suffering from COVID, 28-day paid leave. For self-isolation, 14-day paid leave. And as I mentioned, most governments have only given advisory. Some governments like Telangana have actually issued orders which are legally binding, which you have no option but to follow unless you challenge in a court of law. So with that, I'll pause. I'll leave the debt side, and I'll just take a moment to say, like force majeure for debt agreements, there's no force majeure clause in most banking documents. If at all, it is there for banks. And banks usually have a provision that if there's a force majeure event, a material adverse change, or the project stop, or there's a breach of covenant, I don't need to disburse any longer, or I can recall the loan. So it's the other way around, not for the borrower. Similarly, for equity agreements, most equity agreements don't have force majeure clauses. There's a material adverse effect clause. You have to read very carefully what the clause provides and whether you can come out of your commitments or your counterparty can come out of commitments. For listed companies, what are we seeing? We are seeing an opportunity for the low valuations. We are seeing that, look, there's an opportunity for promoters to delist, to buy back. The creeping window is over because the quarter is over and SEBI did not accept the fact that you can still creep when the window is closed now until the results are announced. But in terms of buybacks and in terms of delistings, those options are available. The threat, of course, is of predatory offers and predatory transactions. And last, of course, what are promoters thinking? I see all promoters, virtually everybody calling that, look, do I have my will in place? Do I have my succession plan in place? I have minor children. Do I have a provision for guardianship? Do I have business continuity plans? Do I know who my next line will be in terms of business leaders? Even if I have a private or a public trust and my family members don't remain, do I really have provisions who will be continuing trustees? What are the location of my original documents? Where are my title deeds? Where are my nominations for properties? And all of this people are thinking about today, better late than never. And I think we can all go to our clients and advise them to put house in order. And what am I seeing now coming? I think let's be prepared. There may be a curtailment of the LRS limit. That's what we are hearing, to conserve foreign exchange. As Abizer was saying, lot of changes around banking and financing. Probably foreign debt and financing will open up further. A lot of representations being made by corporates to allow CSR in kind. Corporates don't have the cash, but they have lots and good services which they can contribute as CSR. And for foreign citizens and passport holders, again, lots of questions arising. How long will my visas remain if I don't have a PIO card? What will happen? Will I be asked to go back? And these are some thoughts for the future. So with that, I'll conclude my presentation.
Thank you, Haigreve. Let us go on to the next speaker, Abizer ji, and then we'll take the questions, please. I have a lot of questions on the chat box. Abizer, please, all yours. Thank you.
You'll have to give me 1 second to load my presentation.
Sure, Abizer, sure. Take your time, please.
I am struggling with how to do it. Is it possible to put up my presentation?
Jitu, you can. Jitu, unmute yourself, Jitu.
Just a minute, Abizer sir. I'm doing it. Sir, if you can stop your
Yeah,
screen sharing.
I'll just do mine only. Just give me 1 second. I'm just doing mine.
Okay. You can go to desktop, sir, if you have saved.
I got it.
Yeah.
Just taking a second to load.
Please.
Is it visible now?
Sir, you have to again start the screen sharing with the PPT as on. You have chosen Outlook and it will show only Outlook. So you have to close the Outlook and start the screen sharing with the PPT option.
Okay.
So can you?
Yeah, done.
Yeah, done.
Fantastic.
Okay. So thank you, Haigreve. Very, very informative in terms of legally what you can do. But I quickly want to just talk about 2 minutes on the global pandemic. We have quite a large problem. Roughly 12.5 million cases. Globally, you have all read the data. It's spread all over the world, except for China, luckily. In India, as we speak today, we have 4,900 cases as per the latest website. Maharashtra and Tamil Nadu being the maximum. But I believe that we are 100 times less tested than the US as of today. So even if we are 100 times less tested than the US, our numbers are fairly large, and we are looking at least 4 lakh cases, if not more than that. This is only the testing. Considering our density, etc., our problems are quite large. So in a way, our lockdowns are quite justified. Impacts that we will see going forward is really growth outlook will be significantly negative. There's likely a recession in the US and the Eurozone. India will get less impacted. In fact, if you look at the charts, there are only 3 economies that are expected to grow in the current FY20 year. One is China, one is Indonesia, and one is India. And India has the largest growth at roughly 2.5%. So if you look at India's growth also, frankly, at 2.5%, we are looking at a very minuscule growth overall, though India has forever had a Hindu rate of growth of 3%. So this is even lower than that Hindi growth rate. Our stock markets have declined around 30%. And fourth quarter, frankly, we are seeing the world's recovery period pre-crisis is what we looked at. 2 trillion is the total global income loss that we are expecting. And 2 trillion, incidentally, is the size of the Indian economy. And approximately 3 million is going to be the addition to the unemployed only in the US. Just by the way, as of now, the total people who have filed for unemployment in the US is close to 10 million people. A result of this is, as Haigreve also pointed out, immigration and related issues. We are going to find nations more and more deglobalized and trying to protect their own economy. Any which way, we had started a protectionist kind of approach where we were not trying to be as global because it was impacting individual economies, because global growth had anyway slowed down. With this, we will see further reduction in growth. We will further see a reduction in mobility. We will also see that global exports will clearly happen. China will benefit the maximum at this point in time, as it appears, because their manufacturing is coming. But globally, a lot more money is being put into various economies just to spur up demand in the short run. And India is not going to be an exception. In 2008, when the world crisis happened, we thought India was an exception and decoupled. We saw that crisis coming onto our system in 2015. Frankly, at this time, we are going to fall and rise with the world. Major policy initiatives globally that have been taken, just kind of give you a flavor of what they are. In the UK, for example, 12-month business rates have been has been announced for 12-month holidays have been announced for stressed assets. Small businesses have been granted funding. Airlines, etc., and specific sectors have been granted specific funding. New lending facilities have been introduced to provide liquidity to companies, and there's been deferral of tax payments. On the salary side, one-time direct tax payments to Americans have happened in the US. Direct monetary support has been given to people in the US. A sick pay leave relief package has been given for small and SME businesses. Large fund has been created to assist small and business enterprises. And retail workers who have lost their jobs due to closure of retail stores mainly have received, who did not have unemployment insurance have actually been given salary replacements. So clearly there is a enforcement. Financial obligations, again, I'll quickly touch. No action against small and medium enterprises. We just spoke before this call on a section 29A type exemption. So here again, no action on small and medium enterprises. Lenders are encouraged to consider workout strategies to help borrowers, and establishment of 2 facilities to support large credit growth employees. So clearly what globally they're doing is trying to support in terms of reinforcement of finances to at the individual or a SME level, and encouraging financial institutions to work at more constructive ways of coming up with resolutions. This is actually unprecedented in India, because since the introduction, for example, of the IBC Act, where any kind of default was deemed to be taboo, we had stuff like section 29A of the IBC Act, which actually penalized anybody who defaulted. So at the end of the day, now there has to be a realization that businesses can fail, businesses will fail, and especially now because of macroeconomic conditions. As I was explaining to people before the call started, we will have to give this kind of a encouragement across our financial and corporate sector, for the simple reason that yes, we may have a few fraudulent promoters who will also get away as the result of it. But this is a bit like law, right? That a few criminals will pass through, but justice has to be done to the larger population. So I think the larger population will get impacted, and the measures that we see globally, I see them coming into India. The only big problem in India, of course, is that we will run a huge deficit financing because I don't think our government has the kind of money to do it. Our RBI, for example, which was pretty much emptied out by the central government last year, does not really have money to be able to monetize and invest into government bonds for investment spending. So the bond will have to happen into the corporate sector. The good part is that Indian banks are now flush with liquidity. And if we are able to enforce better measures on liquidity, for example, cut SLR requirements or CRR requirements, where further 1 basis points we release 100 basis points, we rather release 1,50,000 crores into the banking system. So I think we will have to mobilize our resources much better on the private sector side and on the government enterprise side also. So I see a lot of that happening into investments, but a concerted effort for once, not only an RBI-led effort, but a concerted effort will be required to deal with stress in the industry. I will skip this slide quickly, but come to the next one, which is page 9, which talks about where we see the US INR curve and the BSE indexes and the gold price go. As we have seen, index has tumbled significantly. We are at 2008 levels now. Even in rupee INR basis, we have moved up to close to 76, moving on to 77. And if we end up into deficit financing, I don't see us not crossing a number of 85 to 90 in the near term as a USD INR number. Gold again has been a safe haven, and gold will continue to rise in India, being the largest consumer of gold, and also in markets like India, gold will be considered as more secure than an insurance policy. So I do see gold prices going stable a bit, but at the individual level, the wealth will be converted to gold. But at a business level, I don't think there's going to be enough wealth, because savings are deteriorating in these times. International market performances, we've seen the international markets drop close to 15 to 18%, after having dropped down to 30%, come up to around 15 to 18%, and Nasdaq levels are also at around 7,500. Coming to the industries which we think will lose, anything which has got to do with discretionary consumer spending will lose. Aviation and maritime will lose. Tourism and leisure, automobile, manufacturing, non-essential manufacturing, real estate. Now, real estate, frankly, one could say COVID can only enhance the problem, but the problem was already there and in the real estate sector. And oil and gas will suffer, though India, frankly, on the oil and gas side, there is a view that will benefit because of lower oil prices. And that's the reason why it may be a potential winner. But on the other side, lowering oil prices does not help global trade, and India's exports and services will then suffer. On the financial services side also, I think there is going to be a huge loss, and I will be speaking a little bit on NBFCs going forward, but I think NBFCs are a sector which will lose fairly significantly in this whole bargain. Why? Because the impact of all the failing sectors actually sits in the financial services industry. So between banks and NBFCs, we will see a high trajectory of NPAs. Expectation in the US was that if even despite all the reforms, etc., we are going to see at least 30 to 35% of S&P 500 hit the stress sector. And I do think that will happen in India too. A lot of sectors will face stress. I think we were waiting to face stress any which way. We were keeping ourselves alive, but given that our economy itself had stabilized at around 5%, if it goes down to 2.5%, there's going to be a natural impact on sectors. And given that India has 130 crore people to deal with, we have a much bigger problem of actually trying to feed our people through the recession. And if we are not able to do that, I don't know, I don't want to be pessimistic, but we will see some kind of anarchist rioting, stuff like that also happening if we're not able to push up our demand structures significantly. On the other side, I think medical supplies is a good business. Agriculture, again, agriculture will, one which was a more distressed business in bad times, is now going to turn out to be a very good business for us. E-commerce, given the fact that people are now more and more going to be relying on technology, will increase. Information communication technology will obviously rise. Healthcare will, people have become much more conscious, and they will be, and processed foods as an industry we think will go. I have, in a way, spoken about in the short term what is going to happen, but let's talk about aviation. I think there will be restrictions on travel. One, internally within organizations for cost cutting, and secondly, because of mobility-related issues. I think mobility-related issues will remain in some form, even if the lockdown goes away. Mobility will be in such form for at least 6-8 months. Thereafter, also, I think there will be inherent restrictions of travel outside national borders. So I think travel will get impacted significantly in the short run. And because airline industries have significant fixed costs, we may see shutdown of a few industries. But in the medium term, there may also be some deferral of discretionary spending, and hence travel, leisure travel may especially go down significantly. Entertainment, frankly, as somebody was telling me, cinemas are a thing of the past. And we'll have to see how they come back together, because social distancing will remain as a stigma with us for a long time, even after we remove it. So I think that spending on cinemas, restrictions on gatherings, declining actual travel and advertisement costs will significantly impact the entertainment industry going forward. On the manufacturing side, there will be shutdown of plants. And manufacturing, more I see, is that there will be consolidation. India has 40% of its manufacturing in the MSME and the SME sector. I think that percentage will come down to 15 to 18%. So we would see half of our SMEs actually consolidating out or even shutting down because they won't have the financial prowess to continue. There will be a restart in the Chinese industry. And a big part, I think, that will happen if the government does it right, is we will actually see setup of SEZs in India, which will do manufacturing, outsourced manufacturing for the world. So China will lose its share as an outsourced manufacturing, and I hope India lives up to that challenge and actually becomes a significant manufacturing facility, given that there will be reconfiguration of supply chains. On financial services, I think huge defaults. I see the size of the distress market to be around $300 billion, easily a $100 billion addition that will happen just because of COVID. I see sectors and restructuring in financial services change very, very significantly. And I will want to talk about it as we go on ahead. But digital payments will happen. People will start using, but we thought digital payments will happen even after demonetization, but we went back to cash payments. So I'm not so sure about digital payments in the medium term. Maybe there will be something. There will be a huge increase in corporate credit because banks have been provided so much liquidity right now. 3,74,000 as part of the current 1,000 crores as part of the RBI current circular, but much more to come. And banks will then be forced to drive credit growth. Now, the problem is banks do not drive credit growth simply because they are afraid of being held on a 2020 vision. 2020 is the wrong word to use now, but still on a 2020 vision later on if companies default. And that's the reason why lending in banks had stopped. The government will have to implement significant schemes, including basically providing some kind of a amnesty to bankers themselves for taking bolder decisions. But one will have to evolve a framework around it, because what we really don't want is indiscriminate lending happening going forward. Now, infrastructure, clearly, government has not been able to invest too much in infrastructure. But I do think that if the government decides to do a deficit financing board, which is basically breach our fiscal responsibility rules, then the government will increase their spending on infrastructure, because infrastructure and real estate actually provide jobs at the lower end, which will actually then not only create assets, but also end up providing employment and money generation and creation of demand. So I, for one, do believe that there will be an immediate short-term infrastructure shortage, but in the longer run, infrastructure will be one of the first to pick up because it's government spending. Consumer goods, again, I think a lot of dependency on China, Chinese imports may come down. Sales will drop, of course, but going forward, we expect a lot of consumer spending through India. I don't again want to take this particular slide because Haigreve has spoken about it. I will simply get into the RBI norms. So what has the RBI done? RBI has imposed 4 big things that have come into place. One is RBI has infused a lot more liquidity into the system through a CRR cut, through a repo cut, and through a MSF, which is the marginal standing facility. Because of these 3 things, so the repo at the last monetary policy cut rates down by 75 basis points to 90 basis points, and increased the spread between the repo and the reverse repo at 40 basis points, which is quite large. So basically, it made sure that the banks retain a lot of liquidity into themselves, and through that liquidity actually pass on credit. CRR, for example, PSU banks are flush with liquidity, but other banks were not. So doing it a 1% CRR cut actually infused per RBI records 1,37,000 crores into the system. According to my calculation, 1,50,000 crores in the system. So it's infused a lot more money into the system. A repo rate actually deters banks from placing money with the RBI. It actually rather lets the bank place money either in the corporate bond market or into corporates. And marginal standing facility is nothing but a short-term liquidity facility, which it has offered to banks just so that they can manage. So all 3 of these measures, together with the LTLRO, TLTRO, which I will discuss a little later, have put in around 3,76,000 crores or 3,50,000 odd crores into the banking system, which is useful. I emphasize the word banking system because only banks have been provided with this liquidity. And why I say this is because the NBFC sector has not been provided with the kind of liquidity that it ought to have been provided for. And I will talk about the NBFC sector quite separately. And I'm a big critic of the RBI current circular because I don't think it's done its due to the NBFCs. Now, talking about the second part, which is the reinforcing of the monetary transmission and credit flow. What it has done is that the reverse repo rate has been reduced down by 90 basis points to 4.4%. As I emphasized earlier, a lower reverse repo rate disincentivizes banks from placing money back with the RBI. So RBI has this window where excess liquidity can be placed back with them. So this window has been made to disincentivize by reducing the reverse repo rate by 90 basis points to 4.4. This is the single largest drop and the lowest ever reverse repo rate that we have, which is good. The other thing that they have done is that they have extended the Basel III framework. So under the Basel III framework, we were required to do 2 things. One is to create a 100% buffer on capital called the NSFR. And this buffer was required to make sure banks have liquidity. It was supposed to be implemented in April 2020. It's been deferred to October 2020. Similarly, there was a capital conservation buffer of 0.625% that was to be introduced in March 2020. That's also now been deferred till the end of the year. So basically, banks don't have to maintain the Basel III capital. They have much more capital and hence ability to lend much more. In the financial markets, what they did is they introduced this TLTRO, which is the long-term repo option. The way the repo option works, just to tell you, is that they've opened a window of 1 lakh crore, where if you have SLR securities, which is the Government of India securities, you can place them on a long-term 3 months, 6 months, 9-month basis with the government in return for money, and you can get 1 lakh crore. But the condition is that 50% of this money has to go into the corporate bond market, in the secondary corporate bond market, and 50% of the money has to go into new issuances to corporate bonds. Now, why has this been done? Just to tell you that when COVID happened, the GSEC was traded at around 6%. A premium bond like the HDFC bond, which is a AAA bond, was quoted at 9%. There was a 300 basis point gap because there was so much illiquidity in the market. To make sure that the liquidity in the market and hence the interest rates in the market stabilize, they introduced this thing and said 50% of the money has to go into secondary market. So once 50,000 crores worth of liquidity gets into the secondary market, people are able to then pick up those bonds. The bonds market becomes liquid, corporate bond market, and interest rates then stabilize to government sector bonds. That was the intent. Now, a big expectation of the RBI, and I spoke to RBI on this, big expectation of the RBI was a lot of this money will flow to the NBFCs. But let me tell you, and I will come when I talk to NBFCs, I'll talk about it. This money shall not flow to NBFCs, very clearly, because of other reasons. The other thing is that they have also come up with non-deliverable forwards. Now, this is a market that exists overseas, NDF market, where people freely trade in the rupee dollar overseas, and the settlement of that happens in dollars. So, for example, I may say I will sell you rupee today, 6-month rupee at X price, and when at 6-month rupee, when you come to the spot rate, there is a difference. The difference is settled in dollars overseas in the overseas market. So there was some kind of a surrogate rupee exchange market existing overseas. Now they want to bring it onshore. So they're saying you can do it in two ways. You can do it either through the ISFCs, which is the International Finance Centers, so things like the Gujarat Gift City, or you can do it out of your overseas branches. So banks have been allowed to do it out of the overseas branches. So these are the things. The fourth thing that they've come up with is a moratorium. This has caused the maximum confusion. Moratorium on debt, basically RBI circular says that anybody who has a term loan will get a 3-month moratorium on the payment of interest and principal. If it's an EMI, then the EMI gets extended by those 3 months towards the end of the EMI period. But the interest on that has to be serviced normally, and it does not specify how and when that interest will get paid. But the presumption that most bankers have is that interest needs to be paid at the end of June. On this, there are issues that have been debated to say what is term loan, first of all. If banks have invested in debentures of a corporate, is that debenture a term loan or is that a capital instrument? Banks have written to RBI for clarification. There are many other issues which basically talk about the fact that how will somebody service interest at the end of the moratorium period? Can I spread it over many installments? Can I revise the EMI number? These are actually left to the bank's policies for the banks to decide. On other thing that they have given on debt is on working capital. Now, this is a very substantial part. On working capital 1, they have said that interest on working capital payments is deferred by 3 months, but at the end of 3 months, that interest on working capital should be paid. That's one big thing. And another thing which I thought was extremely sensible is the fact that you can now reassess, in the light of COVID, working capital and drawing power requirements. Most of you may be advisors to banks and know what a DP is or a drawing power is. Drawing power is basically the amount that can be drawn down based on the current level of net assets, in short. So basically, banks are told that you can now reassess what your net assets are. And a lot of banks are reassessing what their net assets are. A lot of corporates are in the process of submitting their proposals to reassess what their working capital cycles are likely to be. And as you would appreciate, that with COVID, those working capital cycles are likely to change significantly. And what the RBI has now allowed is a one-time reassessment of all working capital limits. Now, this does not have a 3-month period. This can go on forever. But banks will now have to come up with methods in which this working capital will be reassessed and quickly sanctioned. Because in the revised COVID world, I think working capital cycles will elongate, and banks will have to then provide that kind of credit to. And whether the moratorium or the working capital changes are not to be classified as NPAs at all. Now, lots of confusion. IBA in one of its papers came out of the fact that this moratorium does not apply to NBFCs. Just to clarify, no way in the RBI circular does it say so. In fact, I was just reading today's morning Economic Times, though I have not verified this with RBI, but it says that RBI has said that moratorium has to be given by all the banks. The banks are just told to form policies on how to give it. It does not give the banks the discretion of to give it or not to give it. because banks have again come up with multiple ways in which they will do this. So I will quickly move on. Sorry, I have a paucity of time. I've explained the next slide on regulatory packages. I will simply come and talk to you about NBFCs. Now, just to give you a little bit of perspective, NBFCs are 21% of the total lending of banks and financial institutions. The total outstanding of NBFCs stands at 23.4 lakh crores. Total lending of the banks and NBFCs put together is around 1,10,000 crores. Given that the LTLRO is only 1 lakh, let's just assess this problem. The total outstanding investment grade debentures or financial capital market instruments in the system listed about BBB, investment grade is about BBB, is 53.2 lakh crores. Out of which the NBFC book is only 15.6 lakh crores. So effectively, banks have 40 lakh crores worth of securities, non-NBFC, that they can invest in with the LTLRO money. So the 1 lakh limit given to LTLRO is grossly inadequate. And if the banks expect that the RBI expects that the transmission banks will actually provide liquidity to NBFCs, that is not happening. Now look at the other thing. NBFC's liabilities, 26% of the NBFC's liabilities come from non-bank sources, which in liability terms is equal to 15.6 lakh crores, the same number I said earlier. Now, if NBFCs are forced to give moratorium on their asset size, and the asset side, the lending book of NBFCs is close to 23 lakh crores. If on the 23 lakh crores, they are supposed to give a moratorium, but on the 15 lakh crore liability side, they are not going to be able to get a moratorium because they are not governed by RBI and are governed by institutions like IRDA and mutual funds who have not given the moratorium. The NBFCs are going to fall into a huge liquidity issue in the next 2 months. And I'm not even talking about the level of NPAs that they will have, and because of the NPAs, the downgrading that they will have, and because of the downgrading, the cessation of facilities, existing facilities that they have. So I believe that the NBFC sector is in for a huge shock. I don't want to, I have to end in 2 minutes, unfortunately, because I have to join another webinar. And I will leave, and I would request Mr. Ramesh to explain the accounting implications if he can today. But the accounting implications on Ind AS on NBFCs are also significant. And the RBI has not taken them into account because RBI has only given a moratorium from NPA classification, not from stage 3 classifications that happen under the Ind AS rules. So I have, in a way, covered a lot of it. I would have loved to cover the thing around close monitoring and the bridging of the gap and how banks will respond to the crisis. But I personally believe that the current system of a June 7th circular, which basically talks about doing forensic, leaving it at the option of the bankers to do restructuring in a consortium situation. I think the fact that promoters will be held liable and any forensic or willful default will not enable a restructuring, those rules will need to be will need a hard look if the industry has to survive. With that, I'll hand it back to Ignace-ji, and I must apologize, but I'll have to leave the webinar, sir.
Sir, Banjara-ji.
कल हमने promise किया 12 बजे ही है ना webinar too. Maybe a quick one, if you can take one. What is your view on the private equity investment? One of our prominent members wants to know about.
Yeah, sure. So I will quickly take that, sir. On the private equity investment side, I personally think that the cost of capital is significantly higher now. Let me give you an example. Today, if you do distress trading or investments in the US, the distress bond trading happens at between 18 to 20% dollar. Which if you add a 6%, and those 6% no longer will remain our exchange rate premium. But even if you add a 6% premium, Indian money will be available at 26, 27% rupee. And I don't think in these times too many business models are able to sustain those kind of cost of funds. So I believe that while private equity investments in India will flow on the equity side, there will be a little bit of a pause before that money comes in, or before the US markets cool down. We will not see too much money coming in. Of course, the US and globally there is a lot of quantitative easing happening, and we expect those bond markets to cool down significantly. Once those bond markets do cool down, then surely we will have an ability to come back. But I think private equity investments will see a 6-month lull.
Abizer sir, can you just stop sharing your screen? I mean,
I don't know how to do that, but I'll just do it right now.
Just on the top, just you can click stop sharing.
Got it. Okay.
And sir, a quick question. Do you see this WTO going apart post this COVID scenario?
Frankly, not qualified to answer that. I don't know.
Sir, over to you, Majeure, please.
Thank you, Abizer ji. Thank you so much for
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. My apologies.
Thank you.
Sir, we have
now we have some quick questions for Haigreve ji. He has consented to be with us for 10-15 minutes more, right, Haigreve?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. We have a number of questions, basically all hovering about, this force majeure and all. A quick question that one of our members has posted is, what about this MSME payment which we are supposed to make in 45 days? Still on? What do we do about this?
So as far as that limit is concerned, there is no change. Question really is that under the contract, if you can claim force majeure, then the contract will give more time to pay. But if there's no force majeure provisions, there is no automatic extension vis-a-vis the payment to Abizer.
Yeah, so we understand revolves around this force majeure clause in the contract, and how do you word it, right?
Exactly.
We have somebody asking on this electricity supply, with clause in the DISCOM is charging commitment charges. What do you do?
So actually, commitment charges, you're not lowering your commitment. You have not yet renegotiated and signed a new commitment. So commitment charges have to be paid. And as far as the supplier is concerned, he's ready and willing. Perhaps there's a downturn, and because of COVID, you can't offtake, but your commitment still remains. So until you have a new commitment set and the charges reset, I think you still have to pay.
Will not this nationwide lockdown declared by the central government, is it not sufficient enough to apply force majeure? In case of
no, that is, you can use that vis-a-vis government contracts and say that, look, vis-a-vis my contracts with government has notified this. But government notifying a force majeure cannot apply to private contracts.
What about contract laborers? One of my members wants to know if there's a no work, no pay policy with vis-a-vis contract laborers. What is the company's obligation?
So as far as the law is concerned, you can terminate the contractor, and strictly as per law, a contractor again can lay off its employees. But if you really see the government advisory, it covers not only direct employees, but also contract labor. So it is advisable to take a consistent approach the way one would take as principal employer for the contract labor as well. And in these times, one has to also look at the social media side of it, because any action taken, even if it is as per law, when it comes to employment and labor, if it gets to social media, a lot of reputational damage can be done.
That was great. And all questions that I find, have been posted revolving around your one line answer is this force majeure, and how do you word it? All of us will need your help in future to word such contracts, I suppose.
Actually, to be honest, Jineshji, we are all learning. And the two things we did In my own firm, we had to review all of our tenancy agreements where we are the tenant.
Yeah.
And I have to admit that there were fallacies even in those clauses. And fortunately, our group medical insurance at least covered pandemics and epidemics. So as far as medical insurance for the entire firm's group, it is covered. But nobody could have imagined ever event like this. So would I really blame people for not having done diligence and negotiated a good contract? The answer is no. You cannot always anticipate something as large and of this magnitude.
We are going to be into unforeseen territories and a lot of litigations coming up post-COVID. We have a lot of professional work, but I doubt whether the clients will pay our fees.
Very challenging and difficult times, absolutely. And with clients, for all of us as professionals, we also owe a professional duty to them. And we cannot let them down in these difficult times.
No, not at all. We are a part of the...
Absolutely.
So, Jitu, I will have, if you have some prominent questions coming up, some senior member or somebody.
HP, when I have just spotted HP Kanodia ji is also there in line with us. I don't know when he has whether not unmuted his audio. Just see if he can. Sir, can you listen to us?
Yeah, Kanodia साहब को आप unmute करो. हाँ.
सर आप
उनका ऑडियो बंद है उनके तरफ से
ही बंद है. तो
नीलिमा जोशी जी ने हाथ उठाया है, उनका क्वेश्चन ले सकते हैं जीतू भैया?
या नीलिमा जोशी जी प्लीज अनम्यूट करो विवेक.
हाँ कर. नीलिमा जी. Hello. हाँ बोलिए मैम.
I just wanted to say it was a very good deliberation by both of them.
Oh, thank you. It was a pleasure.
Sir, PR Ramesh, anything you want to add, sir? Ramesh, sir?
No questions. Nothing at this point. I think it's, as Nilima rightly said, this has been very well presented. My compliments to Haigreve as well as Abizer.
Thank you, sir.
And for information of all, Ramesh ji, we are going to hear you at 11 o'clock on Monday.
You have to tell me the topic and give me enough time to...
When Mr. Ramesh is there, no topic is required.
Then you'll have to do a Q&A.
Anyone else having a question, or else we can have a more lot of things?
Arun Agarwal ji, I think he has some question. Can we unmute him, Vivek?
I think there's a question on this additional provision with regard to 7th June circular. So other than the relief package which has come from RBI now on NPA and SMA accounts and the moratorium for 3 months, there is really nothing else in terms of a relief package that has come. So it is not that everything is stayed, but yes, NPA SMA classification and the moratorium is what we have got until now.
Arunji, do you have anything to say? When you have raised a question in the chat box so that we can unmute you. Yeah, Arunji?
Yes, I had just one question I had put in chat box also. That can we say, sir, that COVID-19 is not a natural calamity in unambiguous terms, or is it also going to create some litigation or dispute?
You see, it is definitely not a natural calamity as defined legally. Whether it is an act of God, and because a lot of governments have actually classified as act of God, there may be a litigation as to whether this is act of God or not. But natural calamity, it is not.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
So, anyone else? You can raise your hand directly on the, so we can unmute you.
In a lighter way, हम लोग को OMG picture देखना पड़ेगा for this act of.
Through President, I would like to say one thing through President for our members, that in chat box, please don't put thank you and this and that, because in this, there are say 100 chats, out of which 9 prominent questions they are missing actually. So please don't write, if you are unmuted, you say thank you and it was a nice deliberation, but please don't put it in chat box.
Yeah, put it very right. Well, please, I would appeal to everyone so that you see actual questions comes in.
अरुण जी उसके लिए 18% GST इम्पोज करवा दीजिए. Thank you.
Arun ji is our past president and GST expert.
So उनसे डरते हैं हम लोग सब.
Before the government.
Banjara ji, you can conclude. I think if we have done, or we have one person. Abhishek ji, you have something to say or ask?
Yes, I have a question. Like in this RERA, we have a clause like if the completion date announced by the promoters can be extended to 6 months, and post that they have to pay interest to the paid amount for the delayed period. So will this COVID-19 case, wherein the lockdowns will be impacting these real estate projects, will this RERA clause will applicable to them, or will they be getting any exemptions out of this?
So as I had mentioned earlier, that every state government has to notify a force majeure event for under RERA. Like Maharashtra is given 3 months. So for that 3-month period, no additional charges, penalty, interest will be payable by the developer. Beyond the 3-month period, it will be payable like usual. So in your case, let's say if the period is after 6 months, interest clocks in, and if there is a force majeure declared by the government, it gives a certain period, then that period will be excluded for the purposes of interest calculation.
Madhav Surekha ji, President, Calcutta Chamber of Commerce. Sir, you have anything to ask or say in this?
No, not at the moment.
Okay, thank you.
Formal vote of thanks, Jitu Kije. Thank you, Haigreve, so much personally. And over the formal vote, Vivek.
Vivek, please conclude and please offer our speakers the formal vote of thanks.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Khaitan ji, for taking your time during work from home, which you have implemented for your group as a whole. And we had a very good deliberation. We had 140 people live on Zoom via video conference, around 400 people over Facebook Live. And we are really thankful to you for taking this session. And we are also thankful to Mr. Abizer Diwanji in absentia for taking a wonderful session. And we all got enlightened with various acts. And when we say act of God, we are only remembered about the movie. So we'll again ponder on that more. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, everyone, for coming, and thanks to both the speakers.
Thank you.
And
Thank you very much.
I would also like to add thanks to Banjara ji for having Haigreve sir here with us. It was really a wonderful, nice session. Thank you all. With this, let us end this meeting, and definitely please do join us at 11 daily. We are having a lot more exciting session for you. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.